Welcome. Today I'm going to do IXL Algebra 1, Q5, Identify Functions, Vertical Line Test. Again, I've downloaded this little vertical ruler. I won't ever be using this horizontal one, just the vertical one, to basically scroll across the graph they give me and see if it ever touches the graph in more than one spot on a vertical line, which this one doesn't. As long as it doesn't, it is a function. So this one, again, even though it's curvy, I never hit the graph more than once along this edge of the ruler. I just take one side or one edge of that ruler and I work along. I never hit it more than once, or it never actually doubles back on itself. So yes, that is a function. Again, I never see it doubling back on itself, or that ruler never touches it more than once in any vertical line. So yes, that is a function. Here's the first one that's obviously not a function, right? I have points above and below each other that are exactly lined up vertically. So if there are points lined up vertically, it is not a function. Again, just like the last one, not a function. Circles are never functions, right? Because they definitely arc back. They go in the circles, and circles and ovals are never functions. So now we're picking which one is a function. So ovals, things that arc back on themselves, are never functions, never functions. A V shape that comes back on itself is never a function. The only one that's a function is the line. After a while, I don't even need to use the ruler. I just imagine or visually think, okay, now here's one of those asymptotes, but if you follow along, it never ever actually turns back on itself. They never actually cross, because this line never actually crosses the dotted line, and this curve never crosses the dotted line. So that is a function. This arcs back on itself. This curves back on itself. Circles curve back on itself. Circles are never functions. This curves back on itself. This curves back on itself. This is the only one that doesn't. It's all right to go up and down. You just can't go right and left repetitively, go back on itself. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. This is my function. Again, it turns back on itself, turns back on itself, turns back on itself. This is the only one that doesn't. Even though it's curving, it doesn't ever turn back on itself. Again, turns back on itself, turns back on itself, turns back on itself. This is the only one that doesn't. Sometimes you could do this just by elimination. This one doesn't work. This one doesn't work. Ovals don't work. That's the only one that works. It's a parabola. Parabolas are functions. Circles are not functions. If you'll notice, this is where I take that ruler and look, I can line it up. So right along this edge, I have 1 point, 2 points, 3 points that are lined up vertically. That's not a function. Here, again, it turns back on itself. It's not a function. This is the only one that is a function. Again, turns back on itself, turns back on itself. Circles are never functions. Turns back on itself, turns back on itself, turns back on itself. This is the only one that's a function. It's getting closer and closer to this line, getting vertical, but not quite ever vertical. Again, this is definitely a function, because I don't care that it turns and goes back up, just can't go left and right. This is also a function, so it's actually given us more than one function. These two are not functions. Again, I see this curving back on itself. It's not a function. It's all right that it turns up and goes up and down. That's a function. All lines are functions unless they're vertical. That's actually a function. It's getting closer and closer to this line here, but it never actually touches it, that dotted line. Again, I don't care that it goes up and down. That's a function. I don't care that it goes up and then back down. That's a function. What I don't care is that it's going to the right, and then it turns and goes back to the left, and then it goes back to the right. So right there, we're lining up points vertically. It doesn't work. This one is a function because it just turns and goes back down, which is fine. Again, don't like going back on itself. Circles are never functions. This one turns back on itself. This one, it gets closer to this dotted line, but never actually touches it. This is a function. Lines are functions unless they're vertical. Ovals never are. This turns back on itself. This turns back on itself. So there's just the one. Again, drag along here. I never see this line turning back on itself. Never see 2 points lined up vertically. Comes close, but it never becomes vertical. That's why this is still considered a function that never actually becomes perfectly vertical. Circles are never functions. That's all right. This is not all right. I don't like that it went right and then back to the left. Again, this is a perfectly good function. It's curving and going down and down and down and down, but it never turns back on itself. Circles, nope. This turns back on itself. This turns back on itself. This turns back on itself. This is perfectly fine. It never actually goes back to the right. It gets closer and closer to this line, but never actually crosses it. This one here is perfectly fine. This one here is perfectly fine. It's going up and down, but that's all right, just as long as I don't go back and forth. Oh, that goes back. That turns back on itself. Ovals always turn back on it. This is the only one that's a function. It's going up and down, but that's all right. And this turns back on itself. Don't like that. This is all right. Going down and up, perfectly fine. And this is getting closer to this dashed line, but it never actually crosses it, so they never get above, one point gets above another. Horizontal lines are always considered functions. And this turns back on itself. Ooh, this one's all right. I don't care that it's coming on and then goes up. That's perfectly fine. Same thing with this one. It's going to go off that way forever. And this one, again, approaching this asymptote, but it's perfectly fine. They never actually cross it, so they never get above one above the other. Perfectly fine, going up and down. I don't like that one. Perfectly fine, goes up and down. This one turns back on itself. If you have any questions, please do bring them to class. And I did that in 5 minutes.